In other instances, you may not want to go to national authorities because the national authorities are the ones who have committed the atrocities themselves. And so you may have a functioning justice system, but that functionality is actually just to protect the state from accountability. So that's when we seek to go to the International Criminal Court. These, by the way, are windows of the ICC in its new building in The Hague. I still remember when it was built, some people really like the windows. They think it's nice. Other people think they look like tiling in a toilet or a washroom somewhere. So that's the joke about the ICC's premises. But I actually think if you go there, they kind of look, they do kind of look like tiles, but they also look kind of nice. Now, there is another way that people can go to advocate for justice and accountability for international crimes to national courts, and that's through the national courts of other states. Under the principle of universal jurisdiction, some states can in fact investigate and prosecute international crimes as well as transnational organized crimes, even if they are committed in another country and even if they are committed by perpetrators of that other country against victims of that other country. So just to give an example of this, in the 2010s, Canada prosecuted 2 individuals for their involvement in the 1994 Rwandan genocide. Now, those individuals committed their alleged atrocities. One was acquitted, one was convicted. But for the one that was convicted, he had committed his atrocities in Rwanda against Rwandans while being a Rwandan, right? But he was prosecuted in Canadian courts under the principle of universal jurisdiction. And I'll talk about a new case on that in a minute, in a couple minutes. And then finally, the ICC can only take so many cases. It's quite limited. People are working to set up new kinds of courts, domestic courts or hybrid courts. So, sorry, a mix of the domestic and international elements which create, hybrid courts. So hybrid courts are courts that take some international staff and some national staff, for example, some international law and potentially some domestic law. So I mentioned the Special Court for Sierra Leone. Right now, Liberia, the country of Liberia, is working to create what it's calling the War Crimes and Economic Crimes Court. Very interesting to bring in economic crimes into the ambit of a tribunal. The Gambia is in the process of setting up a hybrid court, etc. So it is possible to actually have different courts other than the International Criminal Court on that international level. Now, I only mentioned that, I think in in your next seminar, in 2 seminars, you'll focus on the institutions, and there's lots of them, and people will walk you through them. So I wanted to really turn towards this idea of evidence collection and gathering. Now, historically, in international criminal law, this is what would happen. There would be a mass atrocity event or a war where atrocities were committed, and the world would say, we got to do something about this. We've got to set up a court. We've got to find the political will to set up a court. Then the court would be set up, hopefully. Then the court would have judges and prosecutors and staff appointed. Maybe some of them would be national, maybe some of them would be international. And then they would start investigations, and then they would prosecute people if they had cases, okay? Now, the problem with this model is that it suggests that you need the institution to be in place, the court to be in place, the bricks and mortars to be in place before you actually start collecting evidence and doing the work of gathering information that could be used at trial. This is no longer what happens. We no longer expect to wait for a court to be set up to start investigating and collecting evidence. Now, and I'll give an example of that in relation to Syria. But it's important to recognize that when we're thinking of international criminal law and the evidence that we use to prove international crimes, it is fundamentally different than the evidence that's put forward for human rights violations. For human rights violations, you can describe what has happened. You can document what's happened. For international crimes, we have to gather what is called linkage evidence. The evidence that links an atrocity event, a murder, a crime against humanity, or a war crime, whatever it may be, to a specific individual and says, this individual is responsible for that event. Human rights organizations might just say, this event happened and we saw these planes or we saw these people, this is a human rights violation. International criminal law investigators have to say, this happened, we saw this happen, we understand that, but we have to link what happened to an individual who's responsible for making those atrocities occur. So we follow the evidence, right? We follow the evidence, hopefully up the chain of the command, to the people who are most responsible. That's the goal, right? And it's important to note that the linkage evidence, when properly collected, might bring you to someone who's never stepped foot in the areas where the atrocities have happened, right? Vladimir Putin does not go to Ukraine to commit atrocities, but he is ultimately responsible. And so we have to link what is happening in Ukraine all the way up that chain of command. Now the other thing is that a good investigator doesn't just focus on crimes against humanity or war crimes or genocide. Tries to understand what on earth is happening and gather as much information as possible. And you might gather information on human rights violations. Or maybe you'll gather information on transnational organized crimes like the trafficking of wildlife goods or the trafficking of individuals or other types of violations or money laundering. Or maybe you'll find out that there's a little bit of corruption happening here. You'll find out different pieces of evidence, right? Because what you want when we're starting out these investigations is to just try to gather as much information as possible. And if in the process of doing that, you have all of this information, some of which might relate to an atrocity crime or an international crime, but some of which doesn't, that's okay. That other stuff is still really valuable. Does anybody know who this is? Okay. Hey? Yes. This is Al Capone. Okay? This is an American mobster. He was involved in a whole series of murders. Does anybody know what he was convicted of? Tax evasion. Tax evasion. Okay? This man was responsible and involved in many murders. Prosecutors didn't feel comfortable, I guess, in bringing those murder charges against him. But they did find evidence that he had been involved in tax evasion. And he went to jail. He went to Alcatraz. He was convicted of tax evasion. Now, had those prosecutors just said, I'm only focusing on murder, they wouldn't have arrested and got him convicted and thrown into jail. The victims of his murders don't get full justice, but they do get to know that Al Capone had to go to jail. And that really matters. And it's the same thing. If we find evidence that someone is involved in organ trafficking, but you also think they're involved in genocidal violence, but your information is better on organ trafficking, make sure you try and get them for organ trafficking, right? Try to get them on that other stuff. If you have a good corruption case, yes, the person might be involved in war crimes, but if you got a good corruption case, get the corruption case. Al Capone them. Get them off the streets. Stop them from being allowed or free to commit these types of crimes. Now, I mentioned Syria because Syria is really where the international community and advocates of justice and accountability for international crimes figure out that we can investigate international crimes before courts are set up. And the reason is, as many of you will probably remember, and when the civil war started in 2011, there were various attempts to refer Syria to the International Criminal Court. Russia said no, China said no. You couldn't send investigators into Syria because it was a civil war. The ICC therefore couldn't investigate either, as I just mentioned. So what happened? People were like, we're not giving up. We're not just giving up on these thousands and millions of people subjected to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and in some instances for the Yazidis, genocide. So one thing that happened was a private NGO called the Commission for Justice and Accountability actually trained Syrians to smuggle out documentary evidence. And they did that, and they continued to do that, as I understand, and have done so for almost 13 years now. A couple of years ago, the former U.S. Ambassador at Large for War Crimes Issues, Stephen Rapp, noted that thanks to those efforts, but also thanks to open source evidence, evidence on the internet, which I'll focus on for the rest, for the last bit of this lecture, he said that there was more evidence of mass atrocities and international crimes in Syria, better evidence, than there was even for the Nazis at the Nuremberg trial. Amazing. No court. There's never been a court set up to address international crime in Syria. But what has happened is people have documented and preserved evidence and collected that evidence. One other significant contribution is that because there was a UN Security Council deadlock in relation to addressing international crimes in Syria, the UN General Assembly set up the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism to investigate international crimes in Syria. Later, they created a very similar one for atrocities committed against the Rohingya. This body exists to this day and has collected and preserved evidence. It hasn't just done that, though. Both it and the private NGO that I mentioned have actually shared that evidence with European jurisdictions willing to use it to prosecute individuals who left Syria after perpetrating crimes, pretending to be refugees. There's Syria, the little yellow thing. And there are just some of the situations and countries that have actually prosecuted perpetrators from Syria. Sweden, Netherlands, Germany, France, Austria, Hungary, United States. Typically what happened was that once the civil war started, you had 1 million or 2 million, I forget the exact number, people flee Syria. Sometimes the people who fled Syria were actually perpetrators. And people in Germany and elsewhere, victims, survivors, would spot the people who had committed atrocities and say, this person should be prosecuted. And those countries could do it because they had the ability to exercise, as I mentioned, universal jurisdiction. Thank you very much. Critically important, had they waited for a court to be set up, none of this would have been possible. There wouldn't have been the evidence in play. And now, as you know, a couple of months ago, something that no one could have predicted was going to happen, the regime of Bashar al-Assad collapsed, incredibly. And I'm not here to tell you that everything's going to be okay in Syria. It probably won't be. It has a long way to go. But you know what happened? The chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court went to Damascus to meet with the new leaders. 15 years after the civil war started, the chief prosecutor is in discussions with the new government in Syria to potentially open finally an investigation. And thank God people collected that evidence. Because now they're not starting with having to go back and investigate. They have 14 years of information. Indeed, it's estimated too, in relation to open source evidence, that there are more hours documenting the war in Syria on YouTube than there are hours that have passed since the Syrian civil war started in 2011. Which brings me to the importance of open source evidence. This is really where a lot of the action on investigating and gathering evidence of international crimes is going and is right now. And the reason is that there has never ever been, as Bellingcat, an organization that does this work, there's never ever been more information, disinformation, misinformation, or evidence of international crimes out there in the public on the internet. On people's phones, on people's laptops. It is challenging, but not impossible, to differentiate between what is fake information, fake videos, fake photographs, and real photographs that actually amount to evidence. And there are dedicated groups, like Mnemonic, that works in Syria and works elsewhere, that actually collect this evidence and seek to verify its authenticity and then preserve it. So that, again, they don't know if somebody's going to be able to use this in a year or in 10 years, but if somebody is able to use that evidence to prosecute someone at some point, it's there, it's preserved, it's ready to go. And what we find over and over again is that both perpetrators and victims carry online on their phones or post evidence of international crimes. It is one of the most remarkable trends of the last 15 years, just how often perpetrators in particular put evidence of their own crimes onto the internet. I'll give you two examples. Okay. One is from a case called the Prosecutor versus Site. This is a case that happened in Sweden in relation to Syria. The defendant, who was being prosecuted for alleged war crimes, participated in the war between ISIS and Iraq. So it's not just Syria, it's actually specifically in relation to Iraq. Now, he posted photographs on Facebook of himself next to dead bodies, including some that had been desecrated. This is ISIS did this like no one else did. They recorded their own atrocities and put them out. And I'll give you another example of that here in Canada in a minute. Now, the police investigated him because he posted this horrific image. I guess someone reported it, started investigating it. They found the same image on his USB flash drive, which meant that he had it in his possession, and brought them closer to probably what I assume is the original photo. Not a duplication, not a screenshot of a screenshot of a screenshot, not a tweet of a retweet of a retweet, or an X, I guess, whatever it is. But probably the original, right? They got close to the original. So they charged him with war crimes. Now, how did they convict them? Well, you can't just use open source evidence. You have to get experts to verify that it's real. And experts on what was in the image and on imaging itself testified that the images had not been manipulated, that the body was probably a real body. It's a weird thing about testifying to images, but you actually have to get people to actually say things like, that is the way that blood would flow if someone was cut that way. So I can say with 99% certainty that that's blood, not red dye, right? Because red dye would have too much water and wouldn't flow in the same way, right? But you have to get people, you have to get experts to tell the court what is in the images itself. And the experts said, these are authentic. These have not been manipulated, and those are dead bodies. We believe that those are dead bodies. And he was convicted of war crimes, specifically subjecting bodies to humiliating and degrading treatment. A successful prosecution where an online post was the star evidence. Another case, the Prosecutor versus Omar Haizam. Here, an Islamic fighter, he wasn't part of ISIS, was found on video with captured Syrian government soldiers who were subsequently executed in the video. Okay? So you have a video, not an image. Specialists are brought in, and they say, yes, we find that this video is authentic, right? It's not a green screen, it's an authentic video. Now something really interesting happened. You had this video, again, it's not good enough on its own. And the defendant says, look, yeah, I killed those Syrian government soldiers, but I did so after a court system that I was living under sentenced them to death. So all I was doing was executing them in line with a court sentence. Okay? So what do? Well, what they did is they got technicians or experts to come in to do shadow analysis. People who could read the shadows cast in the video in order to make a timeline of events. And what they ultimately found was that the longest period of time that could have been possible between interrogation between what the person claimed was the court's order to execute and the execution was 1.5 days to 41 hours. And they did that based on understanding the shadows inside of the open source video. That's what they used. And what they found then is if it's only 1.5 days or 41 hours between a court saying this person should be executed and the execution taking place, that's not legitimate. You can't do that. That's not a lawful procedure. That's not okay. That remains a violation of international humanitarian law. It remains a war crime. And he was convicted. Has anybody seen this image? It's been in the newspapers here in Canada. This is Ahmed El-Didi. I mentioned before that Canada did these two Rwandan cases under universal jurisdiction. It then completely stopped until Ahmed El-Didi. Last May, literally 11 months ago, Ahmed El-Didi got Canadian citizenship. Within a couple of months, he was arrested with his son, depicted here. He was arrested with his son for planning a terrorist attack in Toronto. Maybe some of you remember, it was pretty big news. Within 3 days, France had apparently tipped off Canadian authorities and the RCMP that they were aware of a video that was online. It was in the public on a website called Jihadology. An ISIS video which allegedly depicts Ahmed El-Didi interrogating someone in an orange jumpsuit and then maiming them, basically cutting off parts of their arms and whatnot. Yeah, pretty gruesome stuff. The RCMP charged Ahmed El-Didi initially with aggravated assault, which is, I hope everybody recognizes, a little bit ridiculous. Aggravated assault is like hitting someone with a pool cue at a bar. It's not interrogating someone in a war context and then, basically destroying their body and killing them. And last November, Canada, the RCMP, charged Ahmed El-Didi, took away the aggravated assault charge, and charged Ahmed El-Didi with 4 separate war crimes. And he will be prosecuted for a war crime that's believed to have happened in northern Iraq in a Canadian court. And the star of that trial will be the open source video evidence that was put forward of his atrocities, or his alleged atrocities, I should say, and again, the experts that can tell us what exactly is happening in that video. Is that really happening? Is it authentic? Etc. Remarkable. This is where things are going. Finally, I don't know if they'll, I think this is going to be, at least with the Magnitsky Act, in one of your future sessions. But I wanted to return to the theme of linking different types of crimes. When you see senior types of perpetrators, the people who are most responsible, the organizers, you will find that they are not just engaged in atrocities. They are making money. They are involved in corruption. They are selling stuff illegally across borders, like transnational organized crimes, committing transnational organized crimes. And they make money off that, and they have assets because of that. And in Canada, as you'll see in a couple of sessions from now, Canada has laws to deal with some of these things and try to seize the assets of some people involved in human rights violations and international crimes, specifically through the Special Economic Measures Act. Unlike any other country in the world, and it's still early days, we'll see how this goes, it's very complicated. Under the Special Economic Measures Act, Canada can freeze, seize, and unlike any other country in the world right now, as far as I know, it can actually repurpose the assets. It can take the assets away and give them back to the state or potentially people who were hurt by those crimes. Have you seen this plane? This plane is at Pearson. This is an Antonov plane that has been grounded at Pearson since February 22nd of 2022, when Canada closed its airspace to Russian aircrafts after the second invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. This aircraft has been frozen as an asset. It's stayed there ever since. And then Canada has moved to seize it, and again, we'll see how this develops, but the goal appears to be to actually repurpose the plane and return it to Ukraine or sell it and give the money back to Ukraine so that Ukraine can rebuild the roads that were destroyed, rebuild the hospitals and homes that were destroyed. This is huge, huge. I just finished a project for the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine, specifically on the plane and other assets held by Canada. I'm also trying to do this work in relation to Sudan with my colleagues at the Wayamo Foundation. International criminal law is really important. We want perpetrators of international crimes to be held accountable. But we also have to think about the universe in which their crimes are made possible. And one of those things is money and assets. They profit from these things. They take money from good people. What we're trying to do, at least, is to think about how it's possible that in a country like Sudan that has so much gold, atrocities are being perpetrated. Well, where's the money going? What banks are getting the money? Where's the money flowing? It's definitely not going to be in Sudan. Sudan's in a very large-scale, brutal civil war. And we're looking at different jurisdictions. I can't share with you now, but we're looking at different jurisdictions and different countries that have banks to hopefully identify assets that have been taken out of Sudan by perpetrators. Why? Because yes, I think it's important that we pursue prosecution, but it's also important that we repair the damage to victims and survivors of international crime. And hopefully we think that if we do both of those things, that people can be prosecuted one day for atrocities in Sudan, and victims and survivors can get compensation and reparations for what they experienced from the very people who stole the wealth of their own countries from them. If we do that, if we understand that those core international crimes I've talked about exist in this universe of corruption, transnational organized crimes, human rights violations, whatever it may be, petty murder, if we think about that Al Capone method, we might not always be able to get the ICC or international courts to convict and prosecute them, and even if we do, it'll take a long time. But if we start seeing that universe of criminality and criminal conduct that these people are involved in, we can at least disrupt their ability to continue committing these crimes. And disruption is key. When we don't have the courts, or when it looks like it'll take a decade, let's at least try to disrupt them. Now, I know from listening to victims and survivors in other contexts, and maybe you feel the same way, that it does sometimes feel like we're being pulled in all these different directions. My lecture probably felt a little bit like I was pulling you in all these different directions, right? It's a lot, and there's a lot of crap right now, and the world isn't an easy place. Sometimes it has me feeling like this, at a bus stop in the middle of the field, not knowing where I'm going to go. It's hard, and I get that, and I'm sure for those of you working on these issues, it is hard, and my heart is with you for continuing to try. But I wanted to return to this theme of sunlight. Things are hard, just like concrete is hard. But there are cracks, and in those cracks, flowers sometimes grow. And it's quite a beautiful thing. Flowers are beautiful in general, but flowers that persist, that resist the toughness of life and the world, are perhaps among the most beautiful. So I wanted to leave you with the words of Benjamin Ferencz. He was the last living prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials. He died a couple of years ago. He was a wonderful, wonderful human being. Very short, but very wonderful. Like very, very, very short. And he was an incredible person whose mantra was law, not war. And he said, and I think about these words very often, he said, the world is full of good people who do good deeds. Sometimes just remembering that and holding on to it can be enough to rally us, inspire us, and make us feel better about the history we are living through. Don't think easy versus difficult. If it's a question of right versus wrong, then follow what's right, right? Let's follow what's right. Let's be that little flower breaking through the concrete. And in doing that, I wanted to just return finally to this theme that if we are constantly measuring our success or our value on the basis of convictions or particular outcomes, we'll miss something. We'll miss the fact that we're here together having these conversations. We'll miss the fact that there is justice in the pursuit of justice, because the pursuit of justice articulates this is what happened, and I believe you. I believe victims and survivors. And I believe that the pursuit itself of justice is in and of itself an act of justice. And I think it's an important thing to remember looking out at an audience that I know is working very hard at the pursuit of justice for the context you're working in. What you are doing is in and of itself already an act of justice. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much. It was a very insightful talk. Thanks, Marcus and Mr. Marcus. It was really great, insightful talk. And Mark just walked up through the core international crimes, war crimes, crime against humanity, genocide, and crime of oppression. Also, he actually give us an example of how documentation is very important. An example was Syria, and I think for the victim it's very important to work on that. I think this is a good lesson to learn, that we really need actually put our all sources together and we'll work with the people on the ground and here to have that documentation. And also the last thing is not just rely on international criminal court. We have a domestic court like in Canada. We had a few examples which Mark clearly mentioned. This is an opportunity as well. If we know some of the perpetrators in Canada or elsewhere, then this is something we can actually build a case against them and we can work for it.